Okay, this video is going to go over the steps and process that's involved in factoring by grouping. You will not have to do a whole lot of these this year, but it is something that you have to be exposed to and familiar with in the case that it shows up on either the SOL test or on your actual test. So just to become familiar with it and understand a couple of problems will be plenty for this year. All right, so it is broken down into the following 4 steps. Number 4 is optional. If you want to check your answer, you certainly can, but the main ones are 1, 2, and 3. So I'm going to go through the example and work it out and talk you through it just like it was done in class, and then I'm going to show in this video the 4 problems that were not done in class, because we did 4 together, all right, but I'm going to go through and walk you through the other 4. So for number 1, anytime you're using grouping, it has to be with 4 terms. So not trinomials, not binomials. This is only good for 4 terms. So polynomial. The way you do this is simply group the first 2 and the last 2 terms together. So I put parentheses around it and include the signs when you do that. So from each one of those 2 groups, I need to factor out the GCF. That's the key part. If you don't do the GCF part right, then the answer is probably not going to come out the way you want it to. So if I look at my first group, the x cubed plus 7x squared, they don't have any numbers in common, but they have 2 x's I can take out. So I take out an x squared, and what's left from those 2 binomial terms is x plus 7. Okay, so that has been factored out according to the GCF. Now you go to the second binomial, the second group, and you do the exact same thing. So if I have positive 2x and positive 14, the GCF is a positive 2. You have to have the sign. That sign is super important. When you divide out the 2, that leaves you with x plus 7. Now, one thing that will always happen when you're doing grouping, and it'll let you know if you're doing it right, is the binomials that remain after you take out the GCF will always be identical to each other, sign and everything. If they're not, you know you didn't do something right. So that's a big, big help for you. Now, because you have 2 of the exact same factors, you're only going to write it once. The first binomial in your answer comes from the GCFs on the outside of your binomials. So the x squared and the plus 2 come together to make the first binomial of your answer. X squared plus 2 is a permanent part of your answer. The other binomial in your answer, after factoring, is going to be just the x plus 7. You only write it one time. If you were to FOIL this back, you would get back to the 4 terms that you started with. Okay, so it does work. You can check it behind yourself, or you can trust that what you did was okay. But like I said, you won't see a whole lot of these, but you need to be familiar with them. Okay, so I'm going to go through down here on the bottom 8, and I'm going to work out the 4 that you did not do in class. So that would be 2, 3, 6, and 7. Okay, so let's start with 2. Again, you need to group the first 2 together and the last 2 together, making sure that the signs stay with the terms. Okay, this is known as grouping. You're grouping them according to their placement in the polynomial. So from the first group, we need a GCF of 8 and 12 and x squared and x. Well, for 8 and 12, the GCF is a 4, and because they each have an x I can take, you have an x on the outside. Now you want to divide everything by 4x, just like we normally do with GCFs. 8 divided by 4 leaves you with 2. You took one of its x's, it still has another x. And then positive 12 divided by 4 is positive 3. You took its only x, so it doesn't have any more x's. That's the GCF part done from the first group. Now we go to the second group. We have positive 2xy and positive 3y. They do not have any numbers in common, so the only thing I see that they do have in common is a y. So you have to take a positive y out. And once you take out the positive y, that leaves you with 2x plus 3. Remember, the 2 binomials in parentheses have got to be identical to know that you're doing this right. Okay, so you take the GCFs from the outside and you put them together in one parenthesis, so that's 4x plus y, sorry. And then the common binomial that they have, that's exactly the same, you only write it one time. So this right here is your factor of that polynomial that you started with by grouping. All right, so let's go to number 3 and do the same process. Okay, some things are going to look a little different now because we start to get some negative signs in here. You're still going to group the first 2 and the last 2. Okay. All right, so from the first 2, the common factor that they have is an x squared. They don't have any numbers in common. After you take out an x squared, it leaves you with x plus 2. Now, when you go over here to the minus 5x minus 10, Naturally, you want to say the GCF is a 5. But if you take a 5 out, you're still going to have negative x minus 2, and that does not match the x plus 2. So when you see that both numbers are negative, or when you see that you have some negatives involved, you're probably going to need to take out a negative number. Not all the time, but most of the time that's how it works usually. So we know the number's 5 that comes out of 5 and 10, but take a negative 5 out. Because when you divide by negative 5, first of all, negative 5x divided by negative 5 leaves you with x. Negative 10 divided by negative 5 leaves you with positive 2. And look what just happened. You now have two exact binomials. So that has to happen, otherwise you're not doing the problem right. Okay, so we grab the outside GCFs of x squared minus 5, and we put that together to make x squared minus 5 as one of our binomials. And then the two they have in common are x plus 2, so x plus 2 is our other binomial. Okay, so be careful, because yes, you do need to watch out for those negatives in order to create the common binomial that they all share. All right, if we go to number 6 next, we're going to group the first two and the last two. Make sure the negative goes with the 7. Okay, and because you see negatives in the back, chances are we're going to need a negative sign. That's usually the giveaway with those. Okay, so in the front, the only thing they have in common is an x squared. I can't take anything else out because they don't share anything else. If I take out x squared, they leave me with y plus 3. Right, so then I go to the back. Right, and in order to still have y plus 3, I'm going to have to take out a negative 7. And then they both share a y, so I have to take out negative 7y. When you divide by negative 7y, you're left with a y, and negative 21 divided by negative 7 is a positive 3. So there's that common factor of y plus 3. Okay, so to put our answer together, we use, again, the GCFs from the fronts of each one. So that's x squared minus 7y, and the common factor of y plus 3. And there's your answer to that one. Okay, for number 7, group the first two and last two. Okay, so in the first two, 10 and 25, the GCF would be 5 for the number, and they have x squared in common. So we can take two x's away. 10 divided by 5 is 2, and you have an x left over. And then negative 25 divided by 5 is minus 5, and you took all of its x squareds. So that's the end of that one. Now, when you go over to positive 4x minus 10, okay, you have a 4 and a 10, so the common factor is a 2. But because it wasn't a negative and a negative, we don't need to worry about taking out a negative GCF. If we take out positive 2 and divide by positive 2, 4x divided by 2 is 2x, and negative 10 divided by 2 is minus 5. So we didn't need a negative sign. You can always go back in and change that if you find that your factors don't match and you need to change it to a negative sign. Okay, but usually the rule of thumb is if they're both negatives, you need a negative GCF for that last one. Okay, so put the two pieces together that come from it. The GCF's on the outside. So one of your factors is 5x squared plus 2, and the common factor that they have is 2x minus 5. Okay, so that's a reminder and another refresher of what to do when you're grouping, right, so that it makes sense for you and so that you can handle one or two problems that come your way in the next few months.